She rode into Pine Ridge with a locked trunk, a bruised past, and no idea that the first thing she'd witness in this town would be a grown man beating a child while 30 people watched and did nothing. She wasn't supposed to stop. She wasn't supposed to get involved. She was barely holding her own life together. But Mara Holloway stepped forward anyway. And that single moment of defiance changed everything. What happened next in that mountain settlement will break your heart, then piece it back together again. Stay with me until the very end. And if stories like this one move you, hit subscribe, join our family, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The wagon hit another rut in the road, and Mara Holloway grabbed the side rail hard enough to split her palm against a loose nail head. She didn't cry out. She'd stopped doing that somewhere around the Missouri border, back when pain still surprised her. Pine Ridge appeared below her like something God had dropped and forgotten about. A scattering of brown buildings pressed against the base of a granite mountain range that looked angry even in late afternoon light. The sky behind it was going the color of a bad bruise, purple and orange bleeding into each other, and the wind coming down off those peaks carried teeth in it. October in the high country. She'd been warned. She hadn't fully believed it until now. "End of the line, ma'am." The driver, a barrel-chested man named Orville, didn't bother turning around. He had the particular gift of the disinterested, that quality in people who'd ferried too many hopefuls into too many dead-end places and had learned to emotionally detach from every last one of them. "Far as I go." "I know." Mara climbed down without waiting for help, which was good because none was offered. Her legs were stiff from 3 days on that bench. She stood for a moment and pressed her hands into the small of her back and looked at the town below and thought, well, you're here. She went around to the back of the wagon and wrestled the trunk down herself. It was heavy. It was always heavy. She'd been moving it from place to place for 4 years, Cincinnati, then St. Louis, then a dismal 8 months in a Kansas town she'd rather not think about. And by now the weight of it felt less like luggage and more like something she was sentenced to carry. Her late father's trunk, full of things she wasn't sure she had the right to use anymore. She gripped the handle on one end and began dragging it down the road into Pine Ridge. She heard it before she saw it. A child's voice, high and strangled with the particular quality of someone trying desperately not to cry. Not because they weren't in pain, but because they'd learned that crying made things worse. Mara came around the corner of a livery stable and stopped. There were maybe 20, 25 people standing in a loose cluster near the center of the main street. They were just standing there, watching, the way people watch a building fire, with that mix of horror and helplessness and something uglier underneath it, the part nobody admits to. In the middle of the cluster, a man had a boy by the collar. The boy looked to be around 6, small for his age maybe, dark-haired, one cheek already going red. The man holding him was big. Not muscle big, but the kind of big that comes from spending a lifetime taking up space other people were too polite to reclaim. He had the boy half off the ground, and he was shaking him the way you'd shake a wet dog. And he was saying something low and mean that Mara couldn't quite make out. She scanned the crowd. Nobody moved. A woman near the front had her hand covering her mouth. A shopkeeper leaned against his doorframe with his arms crossed. 2 old men near the back turned slightly away, as though the angle made them technically absent. Mara's chest did something complicated. "Not your business," said the voice in her head. The sensible one, the one that had kept her alive through hard years and hard towns. "You just got here. You don't know these people. You don't know what this is." She let go of the trunk handle. "Hey!" She said it louder the second time. "Hey!" The big man looked up. So did the crowd. And in that split second, Mara felt every pair of eyes in that circle land on her the way they always did. That particular 2-second inventory of a woman who didn't fit any familiar category. She was 30, maybe looked older from the road dust and the mileage. She was wearing a man's oilskin coat 3 sizes too big. Her dark hair was half escaped from its braid and whipping sideways in the wind. She had a jaw you might describe as stubborn, if you were being diplomatic. The big man's lip curled. "Walk on, woman. This ain't concerning you." "The boy's off the ground," she said. "So it's concerning me." Someone in the crowd laughed. At her, not at the situation. She registered that and filed it and moved forward anyway, because she had found over the years that when she was about to do something that frightened her, forward motion was the only mechanism that actually worked. She stopped about 6 feet away, close enough that looking away would require deliberate effort. The boy was staring at her. His eyes were dark and wide and completely unreadable, which told her he'd been in situations like this before and had developed the childhood habit of making himself as neutral as possible, not giving anything away, because giving things away cost you. "Put him down," she said, quietly. The big man, she'd learned later his name was Cullen, that he ran some kind of informal lending arrangement in town and had a gift for making other people's problems into his leverage, stared at her with the expression of someone encountering a minor inconvenience they fully expected to simply step over. "You're new," he said, "so I'll extend charity. Take your box and keep moving." "Put him down and I will." The crowd had gone very still. Cullen dropped the boy. Not gently. He let him fall, and took 2 steps toward Mara with his chin up and his shoulders back in that posture men like him used when they wanted to demonstrate that the space they occupied naturally and rightfully exceeded that of whoever they were approaching. He was close enough that she could smell the whiskey on him, and she had to resist the impulse to step back, because stepping back was the thing she'd been doing for 4 years, and she was tired of where it led. She held his gaze. He held hers. And then, from somewhere at the back of the crowd, a voice said, "That's enough, Cullen." It was a different kind of voice, not loud, but it had the quality of something very solid, like hitting bedrock. The crowd parted slightly, and a man came through it, and Mara had the strange sensation that the space he moved through reorganized itself slightly around him rather than him having to force his way. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, with the particular lean quality of a man who'd worked hard for a long time and hadn't eaten as much as he should. Dark stubble, dark eyes, a jaw with some old scar along one side that she'd later learn came from a fall and not a fight, though the distinction seemed lost on most people. He was maybe 35. He looked older. He walked past her without acknowledgement and picked the boy up off the ground, and the boy immediately put both arms around the man's neck and buried his face in his shoulder without making a single sound. "You're drunk, Cullen," the man said, still quiet, "and this is my son. Go sleep it off." Cullen's expression shifted through several uncomfortable emotions before settling on something like calculated retreat. He pointed at Mara. "Control your woman," he said, and then turned and walked away, and several members of the crowd parted for him and drifted after him as though being pulled by a current. The rest dispersed. The man with the boy finally turned to look at Mara. "That was foolish," he said. "It wasn't mean, it was just what he thought." "I know," she said. He studied her for a moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Not hostility exactly, but wariness. The kind worn by people who've been disappointed enough times to stop assuming the best. His gaze dropped briefly to the trunk she'd dragged into the middle of the street. "Where are you headed?" "I'm looking for a man named Gideon Cross." The silence that followed was strange. Not dramatic, just suddenly loaded with something she didn't have context for yet. "That's me," he said. She watched him process it. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. The resorting of categories, who she was, why she was here, what this meant. "You're the one who answered the letter," he said. Not a question. "My name is Mara Holloway." She held out her hand. He looked at it for half a second, then shook it. His grip was careful, like he was being deliberate about not squeezing too hard. "Gideon Cross." "I know." His son, who had been quietly appraising her from the safety of Gideon's shoulder the whole time, said very seriously, "Your hair is coming out." "I know that too," Mara said. The boy considered this. "Mine does that too," he said, as though this established some kind of pact between them. His name was Eli, she would learn. He was 6. He was, of the 7 children, both the youngest and the one most likely to say whatever he was actually thinking, which made him simultaneously exhausting and the most honest person on the property. The ride out to the homestead took the better part of 2 hours, and Gideon spent most of it not saying anything, which Mara decided to accept without comment. He drove. She sat beside him in the wagon with the trunk strapped in the bed behind them and Eli wedged between them because Eli had decided, with the swift and total conviction of 6-year-olds, that this was where he was sitting. The land changed as they climbed. The scrub and dust of the valley gave way to pine, thick and dark on either side of the narrow road, and the light between the trees went blue and then gray as the sun dropped behind the peaks. It was getting cold fast. "I should tell you," Gideon said at one point, without preamble, "it's not what you're expecting." "What did you think I was expecting?" He didn't answer immediately. She got the sense he was sorting through things, what he'd written in that letter, what he'd hoped for, what he'd actually believed he deserved, which she suspected was a number considerably smaller than what he'd hoped for. "The advertisement was honest," he said, "about the children, about the situation. 7 children, widowed rancher, struggling land. Yes." She paused. "You were honest. Most men aren't." He glanced at her. "Doesn't frighten you off?" "No." "Why not?" She considered this. "Because I know what it's like to need something and not be willing to lie to get it." He looked at her for a second longer than seemed comfortable for him, then looked back at the road. "Clara, my wife. She's been gone 14 months, he said. He said her name carefully, the way you say a word you're still learning the shape of in a new context. "The younger ones, some of them are still, He stopped. "I know," she said. And she didn't say anything else, because she had learned that sometimes the most decent thing you can offer another person is the room to stop talking. The homestead came into view just as the last of the light died. Mara had tried to prepare herself, but there's a particular kind of preparation that doesn't hold, the kind where you imagine something bad and think you've accounted for it, and then the thing itself turns out to be worse than you're imagining, because reality has details that imagination edits out. The main house was 2 stories and looked like it had been holding itself together through sheer stubbornness. 2 windows on the upper floor were boarded over. The porch sagged noticeably to the left. The barn behind it had a roof that was partly caved in on one side, patched with what appeared to be salvaged fence boards in desperation. And standing on the porch, or arranged across it, in the yard around it in a formation that felt oddly like a verdict, were 6 children, ranging in age from what looked like 7 up to perhaps 16, all watching her arrive, all completely silent. The oldest one, a girl with Gideon's dark eyes and a set to her mouth that said she had opinions and was choosing, for now, to withhold them, looked Mara over once and then looked at her father with an expression that contained an entire argument without a single word. "This is Nora," Gideon said. "My oldest." "Hello, Nora," Mara said. Nora said nothing. Mara had been in enough hard rooms with enough guarded people to know that there was nothing useful to say in response to that, so she just nodded once and climbed down from the wagon herself and went to help unstrap the trunk from the bed. "What's in the box?" said one of the middle children, a boy of about 10, gap-toothed, with ink on his fingers. He was already circling the trunk the way boys that age circle anything they've decided is interesting. "Things," Mara said. "What kind of things?" "The kind that aren't for touching without asking first." He grinned at her, which she hadn't expected. "I'm Samuel. I'm the smartest one." "Samuel," Gideon said. "It's true," Samuel said unapologetically. "He reads everything," said a girl standing behind him, maybe 8, round-faced, quieter. "Even the labels on flour sacks." "That's not a bad habit," Mara said. The quiet girl looked at her and almost smiled. Her name was Bess. She would be the second one to thaw, though not the second to show it, because Bess expressed things mostly in the quality of her silences. The other 3 children, twin boys of about 13 who turned out to be named Thomas and William, and an 11-year-old girl named Ada, who had the expression of someone who had taken on several years' worth of adult responsibilities and was running on fumes, hung back and watched, none of them offering names. Mara noted each of them and didn't push. That was the thing nobody told you about grief in children. It didn't look like crying. It looked like caution. It looked like standing very still and watching the new thing in your life to see whether it would hurt you too. Gideon showed her to a small room off the kitchen, which had a narrow bed and a window that faced east. It was clean. Someone had made the bed recently, probably that morning. She suspected it was Nora. He stood in the doorway and said, "Supper's at 6. The well's around the side. There's firewood stacked. Thomas split some this morning." He said it like a man reading a list he'd prepared. A man who was trying very hard to be practical, because practical was the thing he knew how to manage. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and turned to go. "Gideon." He stopped. "The letter you wrote, the way you described this family, you weren't trying to make it sound better than it is." She held his gaze. "I want you to know I noticed that." He stood there for a second with his hand on the doorframe. "Most people want to be sold something," he said finally. "I was done doing that." He left. Mara set the trunk down against the wall and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at it for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the house settling, footsteps on the floor above her, a door somewhere, Eli's high voice saying something she couldn't make out, and one of the older kids answering him in a tone that was automatic and tired, but not unkind. She put her hand flat on the trunk lid. Not yet, she told herself. Not yet. She got up and went to help with supper. The first supper at the Cross homestead was not a warm occasion. Mara understood that. She hadn't expected warmth. What she'd hoped for was manageable tension, and what she got was something more complicated. 7 children arranged around a table that was slightly too small for all of them, passing a pot of beans that wasn't quite enough for everyone. And the particular quality of silence that exists in a room where people have decided collectively to withhold judgment, but haven't yet decided what they're withholding it in favor of. She sat at the end opposite Gideon and did not try to direct conversation or fill the quiet with cheerful observations about the mountains or the pine smell in the air or any of the other things a person might reach for when they were nervous and trying not to show it. She just ate and listened and watched. What she saw told her more than any introduction could have. Nora, 16 and already carrying herself like a woman who'd had no other option, served the younger children first without being asked. She did it automatically, with the efficiency of someone for whom this was so habitual it no longer registered as a choice. When Samuel reached across Ada for the bread without asking, Nora stopped him with a look rather than a word, and he rerouted his arm and said sorry, with the reflex of someone who'd been corrected that way 100 times. Ada, 11, and thin in the way of children who forget to eat because they're too busy managing other things, ate about half of what was on her plate, and then quietly moved the rest to the side. She caught Mara noticing and looked away first. The twins, Thomas and William, were nearly identical in face but entirely different in disposition. Thomas ate quickly and kept his eyes on his plate, while William watched everything and everyone with the alert, cataloging expression of someone who was compiling information he planned to use later. He watched Mara the most. Eli, seated beside her because he had simply pulled his chair to that position while everyone was settling in, ate his beans one at a time with great concentration and at one point leaned over to look at her plate and said, "You're not eating the onion pieces." "I'm saving them," she said. He considered this with complete seriousness. "For what?" "The end." He looked at his own plate. "I do that with the good parts," he said, "but onions aren't good parts." "They are to me." He absorbed this as though it were a meaningful philosophical revision and returned to his beans. Gideon, at the head of the table, ate without speaking. He wasn't sullen about it. It wasn't that kind of silence. It was more that he seemed to exist in a state of constant low-level exhaustion that had burned away the parts of him that made small talk, and what was left was just the functional core. A man doing the necessary things. After supper, Mara offered to wash up. Nora told her she didn't need to. "I know I don't need to," Mara said. "I'd like to." A pause. Nora handed her the pot. It wasn't acceptance, but it was the first small transaction between them, and Mara recognized it for what it was. An opening that would close again if she treated it wrong. And she carried the pot to the wash basin and said nothing further. She was there long enough for the kitchen to empty out, and then she stood alone in that small room with her hands in the cooling wash water and listened to the house settle around her. Footsteps overhead, a cough. The twins arguing in low voices about something through a thin wall. Eli's laugh, sudden and bright, and then cut off, probably by Nora telling him it was time to sleep. Outside the window, the mountains were black shapes against a sky full of stars so dense and low they looked pressurized. She finished the dishes and went to her room and did not open the trunk. She had not opened it in 7 months. The days that followed were not a montage of small triumphs. They were not a neat sequence of moments in which the children warmed to her one by one, like something in a story where the audience knows the ending. Real children in real pain don't work that way, and Mara had lived enough life to know better than to expect it. What happened instead was slower and less elegant, and occasionally went backward. The first week, she mostly stayed out of the way. She rose before the children, made the breakfast fire, learned the rhythm of the kitchen without asking Nora for permission to learn it, observing instead the way you study a new system before you start modifying anything. Nora noticed this and didn't comment on it, which Mara took as a provisional sign of respect. She was useful in ways that were visible but not showy. She repaired a fence post on the south pasture that had been leaning at a dangerous angle for what appeared to be months. She found a split in the feed room wall that was letting in cold air and packed it with rags and clay, while Samuel watched from a safe distance with the expression of someone pretending not to be interested. "You know how to do that?" he asked eventually. "My father showed me," she said. "We moved a lot when I was small. He believed in knowing how to fix whatever broke." "What did he do?" She paused for just a moment. "He was a doctor." "Was?" "He died 4 years ago." Samuel was quiet for a few seconds, which for Samuel was notable. "Our mother died 14 months ago," he said. He said it the way a 10-year-old says an important fact, directly, without the social buffering adults develop later, because the social buffering is a kind of dishonesty, and children haven't yet learned to prefer it. "I know," she said. "Does it get better?" he asked. "People say it gets better." Mara sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was watching her with those ink-stained fingers and that gap-toothed mouth, and a seriousness that was too old for him. "It gets different," she said. "Better is the wrong word, I think. It becomes something you carry differently. The weight doesn't go away, but your arms get used to it." He thought about this. "That's not a very comforting answer." "No," she agreed. "I like it better than the other ones, though," he said, and wandered back toward the house. It was William, the watchful twin, who came to her 3 days later with a practical problem and no preamble. The barn cat had had kittens somewhere in the feed room wall, and one of them was making a sound that wasn't right. "I can't get to it," he said. He had a flashback of the older sibling default. "This is not my domain, and I am not asking for help. I am presenting a problem that requires a solution." "The space is too narrow." Mara went with him to the barn. The sound the kitten was making was bad. She assessed the space, rolled up her sleeve, and reached into a gap in the boards that she had no business fitting her arm into, and spent 20 minutes repositioning a half-inch at a time until she could close her fingers around something warm and living and pull it out. The kitten was fine. Disgruntled, but fine. William held it in both hands and looked at it, and then looked at her with the first unguarded expression she'd seen on his face. "Thank you," he said. "Sure," she said. It was not dramatic, but that night at supper, William, who had been sitting at the opposite end of the bench from her since she arrived, moved 2 feet closer. Nora saw it, and Mara saw Nora see it, and neither of them said anything about it. The hardest one was Ada. Ada was 11 and had been, from the evidence available, functioning as a secondary mother to the younger children since Clara Cross died. She had taken on that role the way a person grabs a falling object, reflexively, without thinking, and then finds themselves holding it and unable to figure out how to put it down. She woke early, she tracked who needed what. She worried in the visible and constant way that children weren't supposed to have to worry. Mara recognized the pattern because she had been something like that herself once, after her mother left and before she found other ways to be useful. She didn't try to relieve Ada of the role directly. That would have felt like displacement. Instead, she started doing the things Ada was doing, beside her, and not instead of her, until gradually the weight was being shared without anyone having announced that sharing was happening. One afternoon, about 2 weeks in, she found Ada sitting on the back step with her face in her hands. Not crying. She wasn't making any sound at all. Just sitting with her face covered, which is the child equivalent of disappearing. Mara sat down beside her on the step and said nothing. After a while, Ada said, muffled through her hands, "I forgot to order more salt before Orville's wagon came through. Now we won't have enough until spring." "I have salt," Mara said. "In the trunk." I packed too much. A long pause. That's not the point, Ada said, still muffled. I know. Another silence. I keep forgetting things, Ada said. Mama didn't forget things. Her voice had gone unsteady. I keep trying to do what she did, and I keep getting parts of it wrong. Mara looked out at the yard, at the caved-in section of barn roof, and the woodpile that needed splitting, and the garden that had been left to go patchy through the fall. Ada, she said, you're 11. Nora was doing it at 11. Nora's doing it at 16, and it's too much for her too. She just won't say so. Ada lowered her hands. Her eyes were red at the edges, but she hadn't cried, and there was something in her expression, some wanting and some terror at the wanting, that Mara understood with a precision that felt almost like pain. You don't have to do all of that by yourself anymore, Mara said. You can just be 11. Someone has to. Someone is here now, Mara said, quietly. That's why I came. Ada looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back at the yard. Then she nodded, once, the way people nod when they've heard something they can't quite take in yet, but are willing to let sit. She didn't hug Mara. She wasn't ready for that. But she moved a little closer on the step, their shoulders almost touching, and sat there in the thin October sunlight for another few minutes before she got up and went back inside. Mara stayed on the step a while longer. Gideon found her there. He'd been out in the south field most of the day, and he came back with dirt on his jacket and the look he usually had by late afternoon. Not defeated exactly, but compressed, like a man who'd been pushing against something immovable for so long that the pushing had become the whole of his existence, and he'd stopped expecting it to give. He sat down on the far end of the step without being invited, which was itself a kind of shift from the first days when he'd maintained a deliberate physical distance from her that she recognized as the behavior of a man who'd learned to protect himself by keeping space available for retreat. They sat there for a minute without talking. Ada all right? He asked. She will be. He nodded. He pulled a piece of dry grass from the edge of the step and turned it in his fingers. She reminds me of Clara sometimes, he said. The way she keeps track of things. The way she carries things she shouldn't have to carry. Clara sounds like she was remarkable, Mara said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. She was practical, he said, as though this were the highest possible compliment. She didn't waste anything. Not time, not food, not... He stopped. Not anything. Is that how you described her in the letter? Practical? I don't know what I wrote, he said, which she suspected was not entirely true. I was in a bad way when I wrote it. You were honest, she said. I told you that already. I told you what I had to offer, he said, which isn't much. It's 7 children who needed someone to stay, she said. That's not nothing. He looked at her sideways with that expression she was starting to recognize, that inventory he did when she said something he hadn't expected, like he was deciding whether to engage with it or let it go. Why did you answer it? He said. Not quite a question. She'd been waiting for him to ask. She'd been rehearsing some version of an answer that was honest without being more than he needed to know right now. I needed somewhere to go, she said, and I was tired of going alone. He nodded as though this was sufficient, and maybe it was. Roof on the east section of the barn needs work before the first snow, he said, which was his version of changing the subject, and also his version of continuing the conversation she was beginning to understand. I noticed. I can help. He looked at her. Can you? My father moved us a lot, she said. I told Samuel. We learned to fix what broke. It was fix it or go without. What made him move so much? A beat. It's a long answer, she said. I'll tell you another time. He accepted this without pressing, which was its own kind of consideration. It was 3 weeks into her time at the ranch that she found the letter. Not a personal letter, a legal one, stuffed at the back of a kitchen drawer under a broken candle stub and a length of wire, and the accumulated small debris of a household that had been surviving rather than organizing. She wouldn't have touched it, except that she was reorganizing the drawer to make space, and the envelope was unsealed, and she saw the letterhead before she could stop herself seeing it. Black Ridge Financial Holdings, Pine Ridge Valley. The language inside was the kind that sounded official and reasonable until you read it slowly, and then it became something else. terms that shifted, rates that compounded on schedules that appeared nowhere in any original lending agreement Mara could imagine a rational person signing, a debt figure that had apparently doubled in 14 months from what she estimated a fair original loan would have been, based on the ranch's evident scale. She stood at the kitchen counter and read it twice. Then she folded it and put it back exactly where she'd found it. That evening, after the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the trunk. She hadn't planned it. She hadn't made a decision. Her hands had simply gone to the clasps, the way they sometimes did when she wasn't watching them closely, and by the time she was watching, the lid was up. The smell came first, leather and cedar and something underneath it that she associated entirely with her father's office in Cincinnati, that room full of morning light and organized certainty that she'd spent years trying to reconstruct in her mind when she needed to feel steady. The instruments were wrapped in oilcloth, each one in its place: stethoscope, lancets, forceps, glass syringes, each intact. The anatomy text her father had annotated in his precise, tiny handwriting in margins so dense they'd become a second book running alongside the first. Bone saw. She didn't linger on that. And in the bottom, flat and heavy, wrapped in canvas tied with twine, the accounting ledgers. Her father had kept two practices running for the last decade of his life: the medical one, which everyone knew about, and the financial one, which fewer people knew about, and which had grown out of his particular habit of noticing when the numbers people were being given didn't match the numbers that were actually there. He'd taught her both. He'd considered them the same skill, really. The capacity to look at something and see what was actually happening rather than what someone wanted you to see. She took out the ledgers and set them on the table. Then she sat back and looked at them, and thought about the letter in the kitchen drawer, and thought about the barn roof and the boarded windows and the bean pot that wasn't quite enough for 9 people, and thought about Gideon's face in the late afternoon with the particular compression of a man pushing against something immovable. She wasn't ready to tell him what she'd seen. Not yet. She needed to understand it first, and to understand it she needed more documents. And to get more documents she would need either his trust or his permission, and she wasn't sure she had either in sufficient quantity yet. But she had been trained by a man who believed that the first step to solving a problem was refusing to look away from it. So she opened the first ledger and she started to work. She was still at the table when Nora came downstairs at 6 in the morning for the breakfast fire. Nora stopped in the doorway and looked at Mara and then at the table covered in papers and ledger pages, and her expression went through several rapid shifts before settling on something that wasn't quite suspicion, but wasn't quite trust either. "What are you doing?" Nora asked. Mara looked up. Her eyes felt the specific strain of someone who'd been reading by lamplight for 7 hours. "Trying to understand something," she said. "About what?" "About your family's finances. About a man named Blackridge." The shift in Nora's face was immediate and revealing. A flash of something close to fear, quickly suppressed. She walked to the stove and began laying the fire, and didn't speak for almost a full minute. "Papa knows about that," she said finally. "I know he does. He's been trying to deal with it." "I know that too." Another silence. "He won't want your help," Nora said. "Not meanly, just accurate." "I know," Mara said. "I'm going to help anyway." Nora turned and looked at her. It was the longest, most direct look Nora had given her since she'd arrived. And underneath the assessment and the wariness and the older sibling armor, there was something that looked, just briefly, like relief. Like a 16-year-old who had been holding her breath for 14 months and had just remembered what it felt like to exhale. She turned back to the stove. "Breakfast is at 7, she said. "Don't be late, or Samuel takes everyone's bacon." Mara almost smiled. "I'll be there." She gathered her papers and carried them to her room and set them beside the trunk and sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the gray early light and thought about what she'd found and what it meant. The numbers in the Blackridge letter were not an error. They were deliberate. She'd seen patterns like it before, in her father's ledgers, in the cases he'd quietly documented over years of watching wealthy men in small towns exploit the people around them with paperwork too complicated for most people to untangle. Loan terms that mutated. Interest recorded on a separate schedule from the principal. Penalty clauses written into the margins of documents that borrowers signed without being told the margins were there. Victor Blackridge, she didn't know his face yet, didn't know his voice, barely knew more than his name on a letterhead, had constructed something that would eat Gideon's land piece by piece, and had done it the way people like him always did, patiently, legally on the surface, and in the confident knowledge that his targets didn't have the tools to fight back. He hadn't counted on the woman in the back room with her dead father's ledgers. She didn't say any of this to Gideon, not that morning, not that day. Instead, she went to breakfast and didn't take the last of the eggs, and listened to Samuel explain at length a theory he'd developed about weather prediction based on the behavior of the barn cat. And she watched Eli try unsuccessfully to get Thomas to laugh, and finally succeed. And she caught Nora looking at her from across the table with that new quality in her expression. Still guarded, still measuring, but the measurement was different now. That afternoon, she asked Gideon if she could see the property records. He was at the workbench in the shed sharpening a blade, and he didn't look up immediately. "Why?" he asked. "Because I want to understand what we're dealing with," she said. "The letter in the kitchen drawer, the debt. I want to look at the actual documents." Now he looked up. His expression was the specific one of a man who has been managing a problem alone for long enough that someone offering to share it feels not like relief, but like exposure. "That's not your—" he started. "Gideon," she said it quietly. "I know you've been handling it alone. I know you've been handling everything alone for 14 months. I'm not saying you haven't been trying." She held his gaze. "I'm saying I might be able to help, and I'd like the chance to try. That's all." He looked at her for a long moment. The blade was still in his hand. "The papers are in the top drawer of the desk in the front room," he said. "Left side." He looked back down at his work. She went and got the papers. What she found in those documents was worse than she'd expected, and she had expected bad. The original loan had been structured with a floating rate clause buried in the third page that gave Blackridge effective discretion over the interest at 6-month intervals, with no ceiling and no appeal process. Someone had signed the document without reading that far, or without understanding what they were reading, or both. Given what she was learning about Gideon, she suspected both. Not because he was unintelligent, but because a man drowning doesn't always read every word of the rope someone throws him. There was more. Partial payment records that didn't match what she calculated the payments should have been. A lien filed on the north pasture that had no corresponding document in Gideon's copies. And a penalty notice dated 3 months prior that she was nearly certain he hadn't known was coming. She sat with all of it for 2 days, cross-referencing against her father's accounting ledgers and the financial templates he'd taught her to use before she went back to Gideon. She found him at the end of a bad afternoon. She could tell because he was moving with that particular deliberateness that people move with when they're controlling something internal very carefully. She spread the papers on the kitchen table and walked him through what she'd found. She used simple language. She didn't soften any of it, but she also didn't dramatize. He stood across the table and listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence that was different from his usual ones. This one had weight in it. "He's stealing from you," she said. "That's what this is. The debt figure he's showing you isn't real. The lien on the north pasture was filed without proper documentation. And the penalty notice, Gideon, you didn't know about that notice, did you?" It wasn't a question. He looked at the papers. He had his hands flat on the table and was looking at the documents with the expression of a man who has just been told the floor under him is not what he thought it was. "No," he said. "I didn't know." "How long before he tries to move on the land?" He was quiet. "Spring, maybe. He's been buying up parcels on the east side of the valley. 3 families last year." He paused. "Old Hector Maines lost his place in August. He'd been on that land 22 years. Mara looked at her documents and then at him. "We need to prove it," she said. "We need his actual books, the ones he keeps separate from the official records. What he's doing, the way these numbers are structured, there will be a second set of records somewhere. There always is." "And how do you know that?" She looked at him steadily. "Because my father spent 15 years documenting men who did exactly this. He just never had enough to bring any of them down before he died." A long silence. "Mara," Gideon said. He said her name the way people say it when they're about to say something they've been deciding whether to say. "Who are you exactly?" She took a slow breath. "I'll tell you," she said. "All of it. But not tonight." She gathered the papers into a careful stack. "Tonight I need you to trust that what I've shown you is accurate. and that I'm not going anywhere, and that we will figure this out. She looked at him. Can you do that? Just for tonight? He looked at her for a long time. Yeah, he said. All right. She nodded. She took the papers back to her room and set them beside the trunk, and she lay down on the narrow bed with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere upstairs, Eli was laughing again. Ada was telling him to quiet down. Thomas, or William, she still couldn't always tell by footstep, crossed the hall. The house made its sounds around her, the particular acoustic texture of a place with too many people in it and not enough of anything else, and she lay in the middle of it and felt, for the first time in 4 years, something very close to necessary. Not loved, not safe. Those were different things and further off, but necessary. Here, in this house, with these people, there was a shape for her that hadn't existed anywhere else she'd been. She closed her eyes. The trunk was open on the floor beside her. She hadn't closed it after the first night, she realized. She'd just been leaving it open. The snow came earlier than anyone expected. Gideon said it was the smell, something specific in the air the night before, a particular coldness with a weight behind it that old-timers in the valley called a heavy smell, meaning the clouds were loaded and close and not moving on. He'd told the twins that morning to bring the remaining cattle into the lower pasture, and he'd told Nora to check the storm stores, and he'd moved through those preparations with the methodical calm of a man who had learned that panic was an indulgence he couldn't afford. By mid-afternoon, the sky had gone the color of pewter, flat and total, the mountains entirely swallowed. By 4 o'clock, the first flakes were coming down. Not gently, not in the way snow sometimes appears as a kind of announcement of itself, but sideways and hard and committed, the way this particular range of mountains delivered weather when it decided to be serious about it. By nightfall, Pine Ridge was gone. The road to town was gone. The south fence line was gone. The world had contracted to the house and the barn and the narrow frozen distance between them, and the wind was making sounds in the eaves that set the younger children on edge in ways they didn't fully articulate but expressed through the quality of their stillness. Mara had spent the preceding week finding moments to tell Gideon what she'd promised to tell him. Not all at once. He wasn't a man who absorbed things all at once, and she'd learned by now to offer what he could hold. She told him about her father's 2 practices. She told him about the ledgers and what they documented. She told him, carefully, about the years of training that had nothing to do with keeping house and everything to do with the trunk on her bedroom floor. He'd listened to all of it the way he listened to most things, without interrupting, without immediate reaction, with that compressed quality that you could mistake for indifference until you understood that it was actually the opposite. He was a man who felt things at a depth that had no easy outlet, and the stillness was where those things went when there was nowhere else. After she'd told him about the medical training, about her father's practice, and the years she'd spent beside him in that office, and later in the field hospitals, and the country calls at 3 a.m, after all of that, he'd sat quietly for a while and then said, "And you stopped." "Yes." "Why?" She'd taken a breath. "A child died. A patient. I was attending without my father. I was the only one available. And the fever went faster than I anticipated, and I made a decision about treatment that I've gone over 10,000 times, and I still don't know if I made the wrong one or if it simply went wrong regardless of what I decided." She said it evenly, because she'd had 4 years to sand down the jagged edges enough to say it evenly, though the shape of it was still there underneath. The family blamed me. The town they knew believed them. I left. Gideon had looked at her steadily. "What do you think happened?" "I think the child was already further gone than anyone told me," she said. "I think it wouldn't have mattered what I did. And I also think there is no version of that sentence that makes me feel better about it." He'd nodded, once. "That's an honest answer," he said. "I try." He hadn't told her to open the trunk. He hadn't told her she was forgiven or absolved or any of the things people said when they wanted you to feel better without actually engaging with the specificity of the wound. He just accepted it the way he accepted most things, as something real that existed and needed to be accounted for in any honest picture of who she was. She thought about that conversation the night the blizzard arrived, when she was lying in her narrow bed listening to the wind and trying to sleep. She didn't sleep. It was some time past midnight when she heard it. Not the wind. The wind had been constant for hours, and she'd adjusted to its frequency the way you adjust to a sound that isn't going away. This was underneath the wind, a sound from the floor above her, high and thin and wrong in the way that certain sounds are wrong before you've consciously identified why. She was out of the bed before she'd finished processing it. The sound was coming from the room the younger girls shared. Ada and Bess together in the larger room, and Eli technically in his own small room, but usually found migrated into the girls' room by morning because he was 6 and didn't like sleeping alone in the dark, and had figured out early that neither Ada nor Bess would actually make him leave. She pushed the door open and knew immediately from the quality of the air in the room that something was wrong, too warm, and with that particular close thickness that she recognized before she recognized anything else. Eli was in the far corner of the bed, deeply asleep. Bess was sitting up, awake, watching the center of the bed where Ada was lying with her knees drawn up and the quilt pushed half off her in the way people push covers off when they're too hot. "She's been making that sound," Bess said. Her voice was very quiet and very steady, in the way of children who are frightened and are managing it by focusing on facts. "For a while, I didn't know if I should wake someone." "You did the right thing." Mara was already at Ada's side, her hand on her forehead. The heat was significant, too significant. Ada opened her eyes. They were glassy, with the particular quality of high fever. That interior look, like the person is already somewhere slightly removed from the room. "My chest hurts," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "When I breathe." "I know. Can you take a deep breath for me?" Ada tried. The breath caught partway through and she flinched with it, and Mara heard what she heard and her stomach dropped the way a stomach drops when you've been hoping you were wrong. She went to the door and called down the hall. "Gideon!" He was awake. She'd later understand he'd been awake since midnight, listening to the storm, and she heard his door open within seconds. He appeared at the end of the hall with a lamp and took one look at her expression and came fast. She met him in the hall and kept her voice low. "Ada has a high fever. The breath sounds are bad. I need my trunk." He looked at her. In the lamplight, she could see him processing what she'd said and what she hadn't said. And the thing behind his eyes shifted in a way that was hard to look at directly. "How bad?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "I need my trunk," she said again, "and I need you to keep the other children calm and out of that room. Can you do that?" A beat. "Yeah," he said. She went for the trunk. She hadn't used the stethoscope in 4 years. She'd kept it because she could not make herself get rid of it, could not quite complete the act of closing that door, but she hadn't used it. Her hands were steady as she took it out, which surprised her, and also didn't, because her hands had always been steadier than the rest of her under pressure. That particular quality her father had identified early and trained carefully. She went back to Ada's room and she worked. The breath sounds were what she'd feared, fluid, the specific crackling quality that meant the lungs were involved, that the fever wasn't just a fever but was the symptom of something deeper. She assessed Ada's temperature as precisely as she could without a proper thermometer. She had a glass one in the trunk, and she thanked whatever luck had made her pack it, and the reading was bad enough that she kept her expression neutral as she registered it. Bess was still sitting at the far edge of the bed, watching everything with that focused, frightened calm. "Bess," Mara said, "I need you to go to the kitchen and put water on the stove, as much as the big pot will hold, then come back." Bess went without a word. Ada was looking at her with those fever-glassy eyes. "Am I very sick?" she asked. Mara looked at her directly. She didn't believe in lying to children about their bodies. It was a thing her father had taught her early, that children bore truth better than they bore the discovery of having been protected from it. "Yes," she said, "but I'm going to take care of you. That's what I'm here to do." Ada was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know you could do that," she said. "I know you didn't." "Does Papa know?" "He knows now." Something in Ada's expression shifted, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it, that quality of putting something down that's been held too long. She closed her eyes. Her breathing was shallow and fast and wrong, but she closed her eyes and seemed, in whatever small way was available to her, to rest. Mara worked through the night. She used the instruments with the particular focus that kicks in under emergency. That narrowing of everything else until the problem in front of you is the only real thing in the world. Steam for the chest, cold compresses for the fever, which climbed before it came down, as she'd known it would. She administered from the small emergency kit her father had taught her to prepare and maintain, monitoring every shift in Ada's condition with the specific attention of someone who had learned in the hardest way that the details you miss in the first hours are the ones that cost you. Gideon came to the doorway twice. Both times she gave him what she had, honest but not alarming, which is its own difficult calibration. The second time, around 3 in the morning, he stood there for a moment longer than the first time, looking at his daughter in the bed and then at Mara, and his face had an expression she had no easy name for. Something between gratitude and terror, and something else underneath both that was too private to look at directly. "You should sleep," she told him. "I'm all right." "You're not, and I need you functional in the morning to keep everything running, so go and sleep a few hours." She said it firmly, but without edge. "I'll call you if anything changes. I promise." He went. She didn't know if he slept. It was about an hour before dawn, that particular hour when everything is at its lowest ebb, the body and the night both at their darkest point. When she heard something from below, not from the family, from outside. A sound at the back of the house near the mudroom entrance, irregular, not the wind. She looked at Ada, breathing easier now, the fever fractionally down, not stable but moving in a better direction, and went to the hall and listened. The sound came again, something against the door. Not a knock, more like the sound of something heavy leaning. She took the lamp from the hall table and went downstairs. She stood at the mudroom door and said, "Who's there?" A sound on the other side. A voice, muffled and broken up by the wind, and something else. Something like weakness. She opened the door. The man who fell partially through it was large, or had been large. She got the impression of size even in the state he was in, which was bad. Snow-covered to the point of being almost white himself, his lips gone the specific bluish gray of serious cold exposure, his hands so far past red they were approaching the colorlessness that was worse than red. He was conscious, but only in the technical sense. His eyes were open, but the lights were far back. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize and boots that weren't made for mountain weather in a storm like this one. And there was something in his face. Once she got past the exposure, the ice-crusted beard, the vacancy of someone at their physical limit, that was not local. Not a rancher, not a tradesman. Something else. She grabbed him under the arms and pulled. He was too heavy for her to fully support, but she'd dealt with dead weight before. Her father's practice had included plenty of emergencies where she'd had to move people who couldn't move themselves. And she got him far enough into the mudroom to close the door against the wind, and then she yelled without caring about waking the children. "Gideon!" He was there in under a minute. He took one look at the man on the mudroom floor and then looked at her. "I don't know him," she said. "He came to the door." Gideon looked at the man for a second longer, and she thought she saw something pass across his face. A flicker of recognition, maybe, or something like it, but he didn't say anything. He just helped her get the man into the kitchen and onto the floor near the stove. She worked on the cold exposure the way she worked on Ada's fever, systematically, without panic, using what she knew. Remove the wet clothing, warm the core first, not the extremities. Watch for the particular danger of rewarming too fast. The man drifted in and out of awareness. Once, briefly, he opened his eyes and looked at her with a focus that was almost coherent. "You shouldn't," he started. "Stay still," she said. "You don't know I said stay still." She said it with enough authority that he did. Gideon was crouched at the other side, watching, and she caught him watching the man's face with an expression that was neither relief nor hostility, but something more careful than either. By the time gray light was beginning to come through the kitchen window, the storm still howling outside, still total, still cutting them off from everything, both Ada and the stranger were stable. Not recovered, but stable. Mara sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at them. They were steady. They had been steady all night. She waited to see what they would do now that there was a moment to do something, and after a few seconds they started to shake, very slightly, and she pressed them harder against the table and held them there until they stopped. Gideon put coffee in front of her. She looked up. He was standing at the table, still in the clothes he'd slept in, and he looked at her with that expression she had no easy name for, the one from the doorway of Ada's room, and she thought he was going to say something and then thought he wasn't, and then he said quietly, "Thank you." "She's not recovered yet," Mara said. "She needs—" "Mara." He said her name the way he sometimes said it when she was deflecting. "Thank you." She took a breath. "You're welcome." He sat down across from her. For a few minutes they just drank the coffee, which was bad. Too bitter, too strong, made by a man who was functioning on minimal sleep and by feel, and the storm pushed at the house and the house held. "Who is he?" she asked after a while. Gideon set his cup down. He was quiet for a moment that said he'd been deciding something. "I've seen him," he said, "in town. He works for Blackridge." The words landed in the kitchen with their full weight and sat there. Mara looked at the closed kitchen door, beyond which the man was sleeping on a pallet near the stove. "He works for Blackridge," she said, not repeating it in surprise, repeating it to organize her thinking. "And he came to our door. In a blizzard," Gideon said, "without the right clothes for it, without gear." He paused. "Like a man who left somewhere in a hurry." They looked at each other. "He said something," Mara said slowly, "when he was barely conscious. He said, 'You shouldn't.'" He stopped before he finished. "But I think—" She considered. "I think he might have been saying I shouldn't have let him in." Gideon's jaw tightened very slightly. "Or he was warning me about something," she said. They stayed there with that thought for a moment. The man's name was Randall Cole. They learned it when he woke properly, mid-morning, with the particular disorientation of someone coming back from a far distance. He lay on the pallet for a while, looking at the ceiling before he seemed to fully register where he was, and then he turned his head and found Mara sitting in the chair she'd pulled beside him, and his expression moved through several things quickly. "You dragged me in," he said. "You knocked," she said. "I was falling against the door." "I opened it anyway." He looked at her with a complexion that was returning to human range and eyes that were, she now saw, the kind that had seen enough things to stop being surprised by most of them. Not a young man. 40, maybe, with the weathered quality of someone who'd spent years doing things outdoors that he didn't find pleasant. "You should have left me out there," he said. "That's not something I'm capable of," she said. He looked at the ceiling again. His hands, wrapped in cloth strips, were still weak. She could tell by the way he held them. "You're the woman from the advertisement," he said. "Cross's mail-order wife." "That's one way to put it." "Blackridge knows about you," he said. "He had someone look into it when Cross started. When there was talk, you might be able to help with the papers." He closed his eyes briefly. "He doesn't think you're a threat. He thinks you're a frontier woman with a box of someone else's old tools." "That's useful to know," she said. A pause. "I was supposed to be here 2 nights ago," he said. The air in the room changed. "What were you supposed to do 2 nights ago?" Mara asked. She kept her voice even. This was the discipline her father had drilled into her, that the moment you let alarm show, you lose access to what the other person is willing to tell you. Randall Cole was quiet for a long time. He was looking at the ceiling and doing whatever internal accounting people do when they're deciding how much of the truth serves them better than the lie. "Burn the barn," he said finally. "Make sure the family was inside the house before I did it. Not—" He stopped. He said the fire would spread to the house. He said by the time anyone could get up here from town through the weather, there'd be nothing left. He paused again. He said it'd look like an accident. The room was very still. Mara heard the sound of the house around her. The wind, the stove ticking, Ada's cough from upstairs, Eli's voice beginning somewhere above them with the unself-conscious clarity of a child starting their day without knowledge of what was happening below. "But you didn't," she said. "I didn't." He turned his head to look at her. His expression was not clean. It was the expression of a man who had done enough wrong things in his life that the face had stopped being able to produce the simple version of guilt and produced instead something more complicated, more lived in. I got halfway up the road in the storm, and I couldn't. Why not? He was quiet. The boy, he said. I saw the boy. In town, the day I arrived. The one Cullen had. I saw Cross pick him up. He looked away. I have a son, back east. I haven't seen him in 3 years. He said this last part very flatly, the way people state facts about themselves that have calcified past the point of easy emotion. Mara looked at him and said nothing, and let the silence do what silence does. The ledgers, she said eventually, the real ones, Blackridge's separate books. Do you know where he keeps them? Randall turned his head to look at her again. Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration of who she was. You know about that, he said. I know about that, she said. He keeps 2 sets, Randall said slowly. One in the bank vault, which is what he shows people, and one in his office, behind the left panel of the interior wall. There's a false section, about 3 feet wide. The books in there have everything. Every family, every inflated number, every payment he recorded wrong, every bribe. He paused. Every official he paid to look the other way. Mara thought of the lien on the north pasture that had no corresponding paperwork in Gideon's files. She thought of the penalty notice. She thought of old Hector Maines, 22 years on his land. How many families, she asked, in this valley alone? Randall considered. 14, 15. He's been doing it for 6 years. He's patient. A pause that had bitterness in it. Patient is the word people use when what they mean is that someone takes a long time to be completely terrible. She heard Gideon's footsteps in the hall. He came in and stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, looking at Randall on the pallet. The look between them was complicated in the way that looks are complicated when one person knows they came to burn your family alive and you're both still in the room with that knowledge, not sure yet what it means for the next 5 minutes. Randall held Gideon's gaze. He didn't flinch from it, which Mara respected. I know what I came to do, Randall said. I'm not going to ask you to think well of me. Gideon was quiet for a moment. His hands were at his sides and still. My daughter is sick upstairs, he said. The barn's still standing. You're still alive. He said all of this factually, without obvious clemency. I'm going to let Mara tell me what she thinks we should do with you, because right now she has a clearer head than I do. He looked at Mara. She looked at Randall. He's going to help us, she said. Gideon accepted this with a brief nod and walked out. Randall looked at her. Just like that, he said. Just like that, she said. He trusts my judgment. A pause. Does he know everything you just asked me about? He will, she said. She got up and went to check on Ada. The fever had broken in the early afternoon. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just the gradual shift from burning to damp that she'd been monitoring for hours and recognized with a specific, exhausted relief. Ada was sleeping properly now, the shallow, rapid breathing replaced by something steadier and deeper, the color in her face coming back from that alarming translucence. Bess was asleep beside her, one hand resting near her sister's shoulder in the way that said she'd probably been holding it before she fell asleep. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at them for a moment. She thought about the child in Kansas 4 years ago. She thought about the decision she'd made that night and all the ways she'd unwound it afterward. She thought about the moment in this room, some hours ago, when Ada's fever had been climbing and she'd stood at the edge of what she knew and what she didn't know and chosen to use everything she had without apologizing for having it. She hadn't made a mistake tonight. She was as sure of that as she could be of anything. It didn't undo Kansas, but it sat beside it and changed its proportion slightly, and that was the thing she hadn't expected to feel and hadn't known she needed. She went back downstairs. Gideon was at the kitchen table with the documents she'd spread there days earlier, looking at them with the expression of a man who was now seeing them differently, now knowing that the man on the floor by the stove had been sent here not to collect a debt, but to make sure there was nothing and no one left to dispute it. He said 14 families, Mara said. She sat down across from him. In this valley. 6 years of this. Gideon's jaw worked for a moment. When the snow breaks, she said, we go to town. With Randall, with everything I've documented, with what he's told us about the second set of books. She spread her hands flat on the table on top of the papers. But we do it right. We don't go to the local sheriff. He's on the list Randall gave me. 3 bribes in 3 years. We go to the federal marshal's office in Hartwell, and we go prepared. Gideon looked at the documents. Then he looked at her. You planned for this, he said. Not accusatory. More like a man who is recalculating something. I planned for needing proof, she said. I didn't plan for Randall. She glanced toward the kitchen. Or the storm. Or Ada. A pause. Most things I haven't planned for, I just try to not waste them when they happen. He was quiet for a moment. The trunk, he said. When you got here, you were carrying it across the frontier by yourself. Yes. You knew you were going to need it. I thought I might. She looked at the table. I think I came here knowing that wherever I ended up, there would be something worth using it for. I just didn't know it would be this. The wind pushed at the house, and the house held. Upstairs, she could hear Eli's voice. He'd found one of the twins and was delivering an extended explanation of something that had the rhythm of a very important discovery. Thomas, or William, was responding in the single-syllable way of older siblings who are half listening and half not. Nora's voice, from somewhere farther back. Eli, let Thomas eat his breakfast. So it was Thomas. She was getting better at telling. Gideon was looking at her with that expression again. You should sleep, he said. You've been up all night. So have you. I slept a couple hours. So will I. She didn't move yet. Gideon, when this is done, she stopped, organizing the sentence. When we take this to Hartwell and it's done, I want to stay. She said it directly, because she didn't know another way that felt honest. Not because of the advertisement, not because I came this far and have nowhere else to go, because she looked at the papers and the trunk and the door of the kitchen, and then at him. Because this is the first place in 4 years where I've been useful in the way I actually know how to be useful, and I'm not willing to give that up easily. Gideon looked at her for a long time. You pulled a half-frozen man off my back porch in the middle of a blizzard and sat up all night with my daughter, and you're asking me if you can stay, he said. I'm telling you I want to, she said. There's a difference. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. She'd learned he rarely did anything that was quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to one she'd seen on him. You can stay, he said. Outside, the blizzard was beginning, very slightly, to ease, just the smallest modulation in the wind, a fraction less pressure against the windows. Still total, still cutting, but no longer quite at its peak. Mara got up and went to sleep for 4 hours. And when she woke, the storm was still going, but the house was warm and something smelled like bread. And she could hear, from the kitchen, the sound of all 7 children in a conversation that had the particular chaotic texture of something normal. She lay there for a moment and listened to it. Then she got up and washed her face and went back to work. The blizzard broke on the 3rd day. Not gracefully. It didn't so much end as exhaust itself, the wind dropping off in stages over the course of a long gray morning until what remained was just cold and depth. The snow packed to mid-thigh in the yard and the road to town buried under something that looked less like weather and more like a geographical rearrangement. The peaks had disappeared entirely behind a shelf of cloud that wasn't going anywhere, and the temperature had settled into the specific brutal stillness that follows a major storm in mountain country. The kind of cold that doesn't move or fluctuate but simply exists as a permanent condition of the landscape. Gideon spent the first hours after the storm clearing a path to the barn. Thomas and William worked beside him without being asked, which was its own kind of statement. The twins had arrived at some wordless understanding during those 3 days inside, some recalibration that Mara hadn't witnessed directly but could see in the result. Thomas, who had barely spoken to her since she arrived, had knocked on her bedroom door the previous afternoon with a bowl of soup and set it on the small table inside the door and left without a word. She'd eaten every drop. Ada was recovering. Not fast, she was still pale and moving carefully, still tiring after 20 minutes of anything. But she was sitting up, she was eating, and she had asked Mara twice to explain what had happened to her chest and what Mara had done about it. Both times Mara had explained in real terms, without the usual softening people applied to children when describing illness, and both times Ada had listened with that concentrated seriousness, and asked follow-up questions that were specific and intelligent. The second time she'd asked, "Is that what it feels like to be a doctor? That you know what's happening inside someone that they can't see themselves?" "Sometimes," Mara said. "Sometimes you're guessing better than everyone else in the room, and that's all it is." Ada had seemed to find this more reassuring than a confident answer would have been. Randall Cole was a problem with no clean solution, and they all knew it. He was recovered enough to sit at the kitchen table, his hands still wrapped, his face carrying the particular quality of a man in the interval between surviving something and figuring out what surviving it obligates him to. He ate what was offered and stayed out of the way of the children, who had been told only that he was a traveler caught in the storm, which was technically true in the way that many technically true things are also profoundly incomplete. Nora knew more than the younger ones. Mara had seen it in her face the morning after, the way she looked at Randall when he was at the table and then looked at the barn through the window with an expression that was doing several calculations simultaneously. She hadn't asked directly, which told Mara that she'd already worked most of it out herself. At 16, Nora had developed the particular survival intelligence of the eldest child in a hard household, the kind that fills in gaps with inference because waiting for adults to explain things had too often proven unreliable. The plan had been taking shape in Mara's mind for 2 days, assembling itself the way plans do when you're awake at odd hours running and rerunning the variables. She'd spent those nights at the small desk in her room with her father's accounting ledgers open beside Gideon's documents and Randall's information organized into a sequence that she could follow without looking confused, because the moment she looked confused was the moment anyone watching would decide she didn't know what she was doing, and she could not afford that moment. She knew what Blackridge's weakness was. It wasn't greed. Greed wasn't a weakness in men like him. It was a fuel source. The weakness was the second set of books. As long as those existed, everything he'd built was one credible witness away from collapse. He would know that. He would also know, after Randall failed to appear and the storm cleared, that something had gone wrong, which meant time was the variable she couldn't control. She told Gideon this on the evening of the third day, the two of them at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, Randall on his pallet in the corner, ostensibly sleeping. "We can't wait for better conditions," she said. "He'll start moving the books the moment he thinks something's gone sideways." Gideon was looking at the table. He had a particular way of looking at surfaces when he was thinking, a focused blankness that she'd learned to read as processing rather than absence. "The road's barely passable," he said. "I know. It'll take us 4 hours to get to town in that." "I know that too." He looked up. "And then what? We walk into Blackridge's bank and ask to see his private records?" "No," she said. "We go to Hartwell first, to the federal marshal." She slid the paper across the table, the one she'd spent 2 evenings writing, a detailed summary of the fraud scheme with specific figures, specific document references, and Randall's testimony organized into a coherent account. "We give him this. We give him Randall. And then we go to the bank together." Gideon read the paper slowly. He read it the way he did most things she'd written, thoroughly, without performing either comprehension or confusion, which she appreciated. "It's good," he said when he'd finished. "The numbers are accurate. I've checked them 4 times. "I don't doubt that." He set the paper down. "I'm thinking about what happens when we walk into that building. Blackridge has friends. He has the county sheriff. You said Randall told you, which is why we go to Hartwell first," she said. "Federal jurisdiction supersedes county. If we get a federal marshal behind us before we go into that bank, Blackridge can't use the sheriff as a counter." "And if the marshal doesn't believe us?" She'd thought about this. "He'll believe Randall," she said. "Randall has direct knowledge. He was inside the operation. He can tell them things only someone on the inside could know." She paused. "And I have the documents. I can explain what they mean in terms a jury would understand." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Hartwell is 20 miles, he said. "Yes." "In these conditions, that's a day's ride." "Yes." He looked at her. "You've done this before," he said. "Thought something through this carefully. My father used to say that the only time you could afford to be sloppy was when nothing mattered," she said. "Everything else deserved the full account." He nodded slowly. Then he looked toward Randall's corner. "Cole?" he said. Randall opened his eyes. He'd been listening, they both knew. He'd probably been listening the whole time. "I need to know something," Gideon said. When we get to Hartwell, when we're standing in front of a federal marshal, are you going to stand by what you told Mara, or are you going to remember that Blackridge pays better and has a longer memory than a conscience? A silence. The fire in the stove ticked. I'm not going back to him, Randall said, if that's what you're asking. That's not what I'm asking. Randall looked at him steadily. I'll say what I know, he said. All of it. Whatever it costs me. It'll cost you something, Gideon said. I know that. Another silence. All right, Gideon said, and got up from the table. They left before dawn 2 days later when the road had been broken enough by other traffic, or by the previous passage of Blackridge's own people, which was a dark irony Mara noted and set aside, to be passable with care. Gideon drove. Mara sat beside him with the documents in a leather case she'd stitched together from material in the sewing box, which was too small and slightly crooked but held. Randall rode in the bed of the wagon, which was not a comfortable arrangement given the temperature, but he didn't complain. The ride to Hartwell was 4 hours, not a day. The snow had compacted and the weather had steadied, and they said very little during it, which suited all three of them. The mountains moved alongside them in that particular way they had of appearing stationary, while everything else moved, solid and indifferent and enormous, in a way that made human problems feel both smaller and more urgent simultaneously. Mara spent the ride thinking about Victor Blackridge, whom she still hadn't seen in person. She'd built him from documents and numbers and Randall's account. A man in his late 50s, Randall had said, who had come into the valley 12 years earlier with capital from somewhere back east, that no one had examined too carefully because capital had a way of receiving the benefit of the doubt that other things didn't. He was, by all accounts, a man of surface pleasantness, polite in public, well-dressed, the kind of man who remembered names and used them, the kind of man who understood that the best cover for what he was doing was appearing to be exactly what a legitimate businessman looked like. She'd dealt with types like him before, not personally, in her father's ledgers, in the documented cases he'd never been able to bring to resolution, the patience they had, the certainty that what they were doing was simply a more successful version of what everyone was doing, that the rules they bent existed mainly to apply to people with less leverage. She had learned from her father that the best way to undo a man like that was not emotion and not confrontation, but simply the thing he was most confident you didn't have, his own numbers, turned around to face him. The federal marshal's office in Hartwell was a 2-room building behind the post office that smelled like old coffee and wood stain. The marshal himself was a man named Aldous Crane, 50s, gray-haired, with the specific tired authority of someone who had seen enough that he'd stopped being impressed by things, but hadn't stopped being thorough. He looked at them when they came in with the assessment of a man who had learned to read people coming through his door very quickly, and what he landed on when he looked at Mara was something she'd seen before. A slight adjustment, a recalibration, the moment when someone who was expecting one thing encountered something they weren't expecting and decided to pay closer attention. She laid the documents on his desk. She walked him through them. She had done this, in practice, in her head, during the 4 hours of the drive, and the practice made it cleaner. She went in sequence. She used plain language. She didn't editorialize. Just the numbers, just the structure, just what the documents showed when you knew how to read them. She referred to her father's accounting templates when she needed to establish methodology, and she did it without apology, without the hedging that women in rooms like this one often felt obligated to apply to their own expertise. Crane listened without interrupting, which was a good sign. He looked at the documents she pointed to, following her finger, and she watched his face and saw the shift, the moment when someone looking at something goes from general attention to specific recognition of what they're looking at. He looked up at her when she finished. "How long did it take you to put this together?" he said. "About 3 weeks," she said. "Plus, whatever time my father spent building the analytical framework I used. So, if you want the honest answer, about 20 years. Crane looked at Gideon. "This your wife?" "Yes," Gideon said. Crane looked back at Mara. "Where'd you learn to read financial documents like this?" "My father was a doctor who had a secondary practice in financial forensics," she said. "He believed that the same principles applied. Look at what's actually there rather than what someone's telling you is there. A pause. Crane looked at Randall. And you? Randall told him. He was direct and complete and didn't soften anything. And to his credit, he included the part about what he'd been sent to do at the ranch during the blizzard, which was the part that cost him the most to say, and which he said flatly and without decoration. Crane's expression shifted during that part, and Mara watched it shift, and she thought, good. The anger that crossed the marshal's face briefly during Randall's account of the plan to burn the family inside the house was the right kind of anger, not hot enough to cloud judgment, but enough to motivate action. When Randall finished, Crane was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he said, "The second set of books. You're certain of the location." "I put them there twice myself," Randall said. Crane looked at the document summary Mara had prepared. He looked at it for another long moment, and she could see him running internal calculations. Jurisdiction, process, what he needed to make a federal case hold up against a man who clearly had money for lawyers and years of practice appearing legitimate. "I'm going to need to bring 2 deputies," he said, "and I'm going to need this," he touched the document summary, "and everything else you have in my custody from this point. Not because I don't trust you, because chain of evidence." "Of course," Mara said. She handed him the leather case. He looked at her for a moment. "Mrs. Cross," he said, "when we get to that bank, I need you to stay behind me and let me run the legal process. Not because—" He paused, appearing to choose his words with some care. "Not because I doubt what you know, but because if you take point on the confrontation, Blackridge's lawyers will spend the next 6 months making this about you instead of about the documents. You understand?" "I understand completely," she said. He nodded. "Good." He stood. "We'll leave within the hour." The ride to Pine Ridge from Hartwell was another 2 hours. The 5 of them, Crane and his 2 deputies, Mara and Gideon, with Randall in the back, moving through the frozen morning with a particular quality of collective intention that Mara found steadying. She sat beside Gideon, and he drove with the same economy of movement he brought to everything. And once, without looking at her, he reached over and put his hand briefly over hers on the seat between them. Just for a moment. Then he put it back on the reins. She looked straight ahead. They arrived in Pine Ridge at mid-morning. Blackridge Financial Holdings occupied what was, by the standards of the settlement, an impressive building, 2 stories of actual milled lumber, with a painted sign and glass windows that had been brought in at considerable expense. It sat at the east end of the main street like a statement, which was exactly what it was intended to be. Mara had passed it when she arrived, weeks ago, before she'd known what it was. She knew what it was now. Crane went in first, deputies behind him, with Randall and Mara and Gideon behind them. The arrangement was deliberate. She was not in front, she was not leading, she was simply present, which was a position she had learned to occupy with intention when the situation required it. The bank's interior was divided by a wooden counter, with 2 clerks on the far side who looked up when the door opened and then looked past Mara and Gideon at the badge on Crane's coat and went very still in the way of people who have been doing things they know are wrong and have been waiting at some level for this kind of door to open. A door at the back of the room opened and Victor Blackridge came through it. He was exactly what Randall's description had suggested, well-dressed, composed, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being the most confident person in a given room. He was perhaps 60, with a broad face and the kind of silver hair that on certain men reads as distinguished, and on others as the same quality that exists in winter light, cold and reflecting rather than generating warmth. His eyes found Crane first, then did a rapid sweep of the people behind him, and when they landed on Mara, they stayed there for just half a second longer than they stayed anywhere else before moving on, and she filed that away. "Marshal Crane," he said. His voice was even and practiced. "This is unexpected." "Mr. Blackridge," Crane said, "we're here under federal authority. I'm going to need access to your records." A pause. "You're welcome to anything I have," Blackridge said smoothly. "Can I ask what this concerns?" "Fraudulent loan practices, filing of false liens, bribery of county officials, and conspiracy to commit arson resulting in intended homicide," Crane said. He said it the way he probably said most things. Without drama, because men with actual authority don't need drama. Something moved behind Blackridge's eyes. Not the thing you'd call fear. Not yet. More like the internal rearrangement of a man who had prepared for a range of possibilities and was now locating this moment within that range and deciding which response category it fell into. "That's an extraordinary accusation," he said. "I'd be very careful, Marshal." "I generally am," Crane said. "The interior wall, left panel, your back office. My deputies are going to need to open it." Now the mask shifted, just slightly, just enough to show the thing underneath, which was not distinguished or pleasant or any of the surface qualities. "You have no authority to see." "I have a federal warrant," Crane said, and produced it from his coat pocket with the matter-of-fact quality of a man who had been doing this long enough that producing warrants had lost all of its theater and retained only its function. Blackridge looked at the warrant. His eyes moved across it quickly. Then he looked up and his gaze went past Crane to Randall. And what happened in his expression at that moment was not something Mara would forget. The rapid transit from recognition to calculation to something that crossed into contempt and then was suppressed, because contempt was not useful right now, and Victor Blackridge was, above everything, a man who suppressed what wasn't useful. "You have nothing that will hold up," he said. Quieter now, the public room voice dropping slightly, some of the performance coming off. "Whatever you think you have, I have lawyers who have been paid a great deal of money to make things not hold up." "That may be," Crane said. "We'll see." He nodded to his deputies. They moved past Blackridge toward the back office. Blackridge moved to intercept, and one of the deputies put a hand on his arm. Not rough, just definitive, and he stopped. And for a moment the room held that particular quality of a thing balanced on a very narrow edge. Mara was standing behind and slightly to the left of Gideon. She was watching Blackridge's face. She was watching the calculation happen in real time, the options being evaluated and discarded, the usual levers being tested against this particular situation and found inadequate. He looked at her again. "You," he said. Not loud, almost conversational. "You're the woman from Cross's advertisement." "That's right," she said. "You've been at the ranch." His eyes were doing that rapid assessment she'd seen when he walked in, categorizing, evaluating. "You put this together." She didn't answer immediately. She thought about what Crane had told her. She thought about how a man like this would use whatever she said. "Marshal Crane put it together," she said. "I just read some documents." Something crossed his face. It might have been contempt, or might have been something more unsettled than that. The recognition of having underestimated the specific thing you'd been warned to watch for. "I was told you were nobody," he said. "Just a woman with a dead man's bag." "That's what I am," she said pleasantly. From the back office came the sound of something being moved, the particular hollow sound of a false panel opening, and then a different kind of silence from the deputies, the kind that meant they'd found something. Blackridge heard it too. She watched him hear it, watched the calculation run out of options. One of the deputies appeared in the back doorway. He was holding 2 leather-bound ledgers, the kind that were slightly larger than standard accounting books, and had no identifying marks on the covers. "Marshal," the deputy said. Crane looked at the ledgers and then at Blackridge. Blackridge said nothing. Mara had thought, before this moment, that watching the culmination of weeks of work would feel a certain way, some specific version of satisfaction or completion or vindication. She'd imagined it during the long nights at the desk when she was cross-referencing numbers and checking her own calculations for the 4th time. The moment the thing landed, what she actually felt was mostly tired and clear, and something quieter than satisfaction, more like the sense that a load she'd been carrying had been set down and was now sitting on the floor where it could be examined without having to be held. What followed was not quick and was not simple. These things never were. Blackridge was taken into federal custody within the hour. The 2 clerks, both of whom turned out to have more knowledge of what was in those backroom ledgers than they should have been comfortable with, were detained separately. The county sheriff was sent a notice of federal jurisdiction that effectively removed him from any involvement in the proceedings, which Crane handled with the efficiency of a man who had dealt with compromised local law enforcement before. It took most of the afternoon to begin the process of securing the documents. Mara sat with one of Crane's deputies for 2 hours going through the ledgers page by page, using her father's templates to annotate what each entry meant in plain language, building the kind of explanatory document that could be put in front of a judge who hadn't spent weeks reading nothing else. The deputy, a young man named Peters, who had started the afternoon with a certain skeptical deference and ended it with something closer to genuine respect, kept stopping her to make sure he'd understood a particular entry correctly. "You're sure about that one?" he said, pointing to a column in the third ledger. "That's a penalty interest charge on a loan that's already been paid in full," she said. "He charged Hector Maines for a debt that didn't exist. That entry alone is fraud in 3 different ways." Peters looked at the entry and then wrote something in his notebook. Gideon stayed near the door for most of the afternoon, not impatiently. He moved the way he moved when he was managing something internal, with that contained quality, and occasionally she looked up from the documents and found him watching her, and then looking away again toward the street, where a small number of townspeople had gathered at a careful distance. Word having gotten out the way word always gets out in small settlements, moving faster than any actual communication mechanism could account for. At one point, toward the end of the afternoon, Blackridge was being escorted through the main room in custody, and he stopped, or the deputies allowed him a pause, she was never sure which, in front of Gideon. They looked at each other for a moment. 2 men who had existed in a specific relationship of power and debt for long enough that removing the financial mechanism of it left something strange and exposed underneath. Blackridge said, "I would have let your family keep the house." Gideon looked at him steadily. "My family was going to burn in it," he said. A silence. "I want you to know," Gideon said, very quietly and very evenly, "that what happens to you in court is federal business, and I'm not involved in it. But I want you to understand what you tried to do. To 7 children. He didn't elaborate on it. He just let it sit, which was, she thought, more effective than any elaboration would have been. Blackridge had nothing to say to that. The deputies moved him out. Gideon stood for a moment after the door closed, looking at the floor with that compressed expression. Then he looked up and found Mara watching him. "The lien on the north pasture," he said. "That's released?" "Crane's filing the release this afternoon," she said. "It'll be recorded within the week. The north pasture is yours." Something in his face changed. She'd seen it shift before under various pressures, but this was different. This was the specific shift of something that had been held tight for a very long time, releasing its tension, like a knot finally worked loose. It didn't look like joy exactly. It looked like a man remembering what solid ground felt like after a long time of not being sure where it was. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for weeks. That careful, thorough look, but different now, without whatever was in it before that kept him at arm's length from what he was seeing. "Your father," he said. "He'd have been—" "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "He was gone before any of this happened. He doesn't get credit or blame for it." "I was going to say he'd have been proud," Gideon said. "But you're right, this was you." She looked at him. "This was us," she said. On the ride home, the sun was already going behind the peaks, the sky going those impossible colors it went in the mountains at this hour. Colors that seemed aggressive in their beauty, like the landscape was insisting on something. Mara sat beside Gideon and Randall rode behind them, and no one said much, and the wagon moved through the frozen road with the horses working steadily and their breath coming in visible clouds. Randall would go back to Hartwell with Crane in the morning to give his formal deposition. After that, she didn't know what would happen to him. Crane had indicated that cooperation would be considered in whatever proceedings followed. She thought of him mentioning his son, 3 years unseen, and thought that whatever happened next for Randall Cole, the terms of his life had probably changed in ways neither of them could fully account for. She was too tired to think about it much more than that. She was thinking instead about the house they were driving toward, about Ada getting stronger, about Eli's voice at breakfast, about Nora handing her the pot that first night, that small provisional opening, about Samuel and his gap-toothed certainty that he was the smartest one, which was, she had come to believe, not wrong, about the trunk on the floor of her room, open, the instruments inside it used and returned and ready. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah. When we get back." She paused. I want to talk to Crane tomorrow about the other families. The 14 in the valley. There may be things in those ledgers, documents that could help get their land back too. I'm not sure all of it can be reversed, but some of it... Mara. I know. Tonight. Tonight you sleep, he said. Tomorrow you can save the valley. She looked at him. There was something in his voice, not teasing exactly, but something that had a warmth in it that hadn't been there 2 months ago. The way a voice changes when the person using it has decided to stop holding back the part that's been held back. The valley might need a doctor more than it needs financial intervention, she said. It needs both, he said. It probably does, she agreed. The house came into view as they crested the last rise. Lamplight in the windows, smoke from the chimney, the barn with its patched roof visible against the darkening sky. As they pulled into the yard, the front door opened and Eli appeared in it wearing his nightshirt, which meant he was supposed to be in bed. And behind him Nora appeared, and behind Nora the others, because when one child in a household decides to wait up, the others follow whether they intend to or not. Eli came across the porch in his bare feet, which earned him a sound of protest from Nora, and he stopped at the edge of the porch steps and looked at them with that wide, dark-eyed seriousness he'd turned on Mara the very first day, the look that didn't hold anything back. "Did it work?" he said. Gideon climbed down from the wagon and picked him up, which Eli submitted to without protest, which was itself unusual. He was 6 and had strong opinions about being treated as younger than his sophistication warranted. "Yeah," Gideon said. "It worked." Eli looked at Mara over his father's shoulder with that expression she'd come to understand was his version of processing something large. "Because of Mara?" he said. Gideon looked at Mara too. "Yeah," he said. "Because of Mara." She climbed down from the wagon, and her legs were stiff from the cold and the hours, and she stood for a moment in the yard with the lamplight coming from the windows, and Nora watching her from the porch with that long, assessing look. And then Nora stepped back and held the door open, which was the most Nora thing she could have done. Not an embrace, not a declaration, just the door held open. Come in, which was, Mara had learned, exactly how Nora expressed most things that mattered. She went up the steps and through the door. The house was warm. The week after Blackridge's arrest was not a celebration. It was paperwork. Mara had known it would be. She'd told herself it would be during the long nights of preparation because she understood that the dramatic moment, the warrant, the deputies, the false panel opening, the ledgers coming into the light, was just the hinge. What came after the hinge was the long work of actually putting things back the way they'd been taken apart, which was slower and less visible and considerably less satisfying in the immediate term. Marshal Crane sent a rider back from Hartwell with confirmation that Blackridge and his 2 primary associates had been formally charged under federal statute. The county sheriff, whose name was in the ledgers attached to 3 separate payments that Mara had annotated in plain language for Deputy Peters, had been suspended pending investigation and replaced temporarily by Crane's deputy, which was an imperfect solution but better than the alternative. 2 of the local officials whose names appeared in the bribery records had already retained lawyers, which was, Crane wrote in his accompanying letter, exactly what guilty men with money did and exactly what he'd expected. The letter also contained, almost as an aside in the second paragraph, a sentence that Mara read 3 times. "Your documentation of the fraudulent accounts is the most complete and organized forensic financial record I have encountered in 14 years of federal work. If you are ever interested in consulting on similar cases, please contact this office." She folded the letter and put it in the bottom of the trunk, on top of her father's anatomy text. She didn't tell Gideon about that part. Not yet. There was too much happening in the immediate present to introduce a hypothetical future, and she'd learned that with Gideon, the sequencing of information mattered, not because he couldn't handle complexity, but because he processed things thoroughly and one at a time, and she respected that. What the immediate present contained was this: 14 families in the Pine Ridge Valley who had been systematically defrauded over 6 years, most of whom didn't yet know that the thing holding them under was in federal custody, and that the documents proving their debts were fraudulent were currently in a marshal's evidence room in Hartwell. Someone needed to tell them. Mara and Gideon drove to each property over the course of 4 days. It was not a triumphant tour. Some of the families were wary. They'd been dealing with a system that had failed them for long enough that a woman arriving with good news struck them as either a trick or a mistake. One man, a rancher named Burl Estes, who had lost his east pasture to a Black Ridge lean 8 months earlier, stood in his doorway and listened to everything Mara said and then said, very flatly, "People have been saying things would be set right around here for 6 years. You'll excuse me if I don't start expecting anything until I see paper." "That's fair," she said. "You'll see paper within the month. I promise you that." He looked at her the way people look at promises they've heard before. She went back 4 weeks later with the federal reversal documents, and she stood on that same porch and handed them to him. And Burl Estes looked at the paper and read it twice, and then looked up at her with an expression that was too complicated for easy description. Not joy, not relief, more like the look of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for so long that when it comes off, he isn't sure he trusts the lightness and has to stand very still to check that he hasn't imagined it. He didn't say thank you. He said, "You'd better come in and have coffee." She went in and had coffee. That was how it generally went. Not with ceremony, not with the kind of moment you could point to and say, "Here, this is where everything changed." It went one kitchen at a time, one porch at a time, one family learning that the thing that had been pressing them down was going to be lifted. Some of them cried. Most of them didn't. The ones who didn't were usually the ones who had the most to lose if they let themselves feel it before the paper was in their hands. Hector Maines, who had lost the property he'd worked for 22 years, who had moved into a single room above the hardware store in town after the foreclosure, was one of the last ones she visited because his case was more complicated. The land had already been transferred, and there were additional legal steps required to reverse it, and she didn't want to give him hope that collapsed. She waited until Crane confirmed the reversal was proceeding before she went. He was 71, small and precise in the way of men who had spent decades doing exact physical work, with hands that were entirely disproportionate to the rest of him, large and scarred and careful. She told him, all of it, clearly and in sequence. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I planted 50 apple trees on that land in 1861. They'll be bearing now." "I know," she said. "I used to think about those trees," he said, "in the room upstairs, whether anybody was tending them." He looked at his hands. "Probably nobody was." "The federal order requires the property be returned in good faith," she said. "Whatever's been done to it in your absence has to be accounted for." He looked up. "You know a lot," he said. "Not as a challenge, just an observation, the way an old man states things he finds interesting about the world." "My father taught me," she said. He nodded as though this was sufficient explanation because at 71, certain explanations simply were sufficient without requiring elaboration. She was in town the afternoon he drove his wagon back out to the land. She hadn't planned to be, it just happened that she was making a supply run that day, and she saw him pass on the main street sitting straight-backed in the wagon seat, with his hands on the reins and his face doing nothing in particular, just looking at the road ahead. She watched him until he was out of sight. She thought about her father then. She thought about his ledgers, all those documented cases that never made it to resolution, and she thought that if there was any accounting for things beyond the material world, she hoped somehow that what had happened here in this valley had been registered somewhere in whatever column his work belonged to. She didn't believe in the mechanics of that, not in any formal sense, but she thought it anyway, and it wasn't an unpleasant thought, so she let it stay. The valley changed in increments after that. Not overnight, not in the clean way that stories sometimes describe transformation, as though an entire community shifts register like a key change in music. It changed the way things actually change, slowly, messily, with reversals and reluctances, and the occasional person who clung to their established grievance past the point where the grievance had anything left to attach to. There were people who had done business with Black Ridge willingly enough, who had benefited from the arrangement, or looked the other way while their neighbors were being eaten, and those people were still there and still had to be dealt with, and that was its own complicated ongoing work. But the work was possible now. That was the difference. And Mara had something to do. She reopened her father's practice on a Friday morning in what had been a storage room behind the dry goods store, whose owner, a woman named Patience Gould, about 60, with the permanently skeptical expression of someone who had extended too much credit over the years, and been burned by most of it, offered the space for a reduced rate after Mara spent 45 minutes explaining what she intended to do with it. "A woman doctor," Patience Gould said. "She said it the way you say a thing you're testing in your mouth before deciding how you feel about it." "A trained one," Mara said. "My father practiced for 30 years. I trained alongside him from the age of 12. "And you have the instruments?" "I have the instruments." Patience looked at her steadily. "My granddaughter has been having headaches since October," she said. "The kind that start behind one eye. Dr. Merrill in Hartwell told us it was hysteria and gave her powders that made her sleep 14 hours. "That's not a headache presentation I'd call hysteria," Mara said. "Bring her in." Patience looked at her for another moment. "First of the month," she said. "Reduced rate." She put out a hand and Mara shook it, and that was that. The first weeks were lean. She had regulars, Patience's granddaughter, whose headaches she was able to attribute with reasonable confidence to a vision problem that a simple set of corrective lenses from the catalog would address, which made Patience an effective advertisement whether she intended to be or not. A child with a persistent cough. A man who had broken 2 fingers setting fence posts and hadn't had them set properly because the nearest physician was 20 miles away. The standard inventory of a rural practice, things that shouldn't have gotten as bad as they had because the distance to care was too great and the cost was too high. She charged what people could pay. Sometimes that was money. Sometimes it was labor or food or the use of a tool for a week, which was the frontier economy and had always been the frontier economy, and she operated within it without complaint because her father had operated within it and had told her once that the best way to understand what a community needed was to look at what it bartered for before it had cash. Gideon helped her move a proper examination table into the space on a Saturday when the children were supposed to be doing other things, and instead all showed up and got in the way in their various characteristic fashions. Eli offering opinions on where everything should go, Samuel reading the labels on the supply jars and asking questions about each one, Ada hovering with the focused attention of someone taking careful notes. Even Nora came, ostensibly to bring lunch and actually to look at everything with the same assessing thoroughness she brought to most of her observations. "It's smaller than I thought," Nora said, looking around the room. "It's enough," Mara said. "You'll need more light in the winter." "I'm getting a second lamp." Nora looked at the examination table and then at the trunk, which Mara had placed against the wall under the single window. Something in Nora's expression shifted in the way it sometimes did when she was processing something she didn't have an easy word for. "She'd have liked you," Nora said. "She didn't say who. She didn't need to." Mara was quiet for a moment. She'd learned, by now, to receive things Nora said without making them into more than Nora had offered. "I think I'd have liked her too," she said, "from what you've all told me." She was practical, Nora said, which was exactly what Gideon had said. And Mara recognized that Nora had absorbed her father's highest form of praise so deeply that it had become her own vocabulary. "So are you," Mara said. Nora looked at her directly. "I'm going to study medicine," she said. It came out with the quality of something that had been decided for a long time and was only now being said out loud. "When Thomas is old enough to take over more of the ranch work, I've been reading your father's anatomy text." She paused. "I hope that was all right. It was on the table." Mara looked at her. 16 years old, with that set jaw and those dark eyes and the particular determination of someone who had already proven to herself that she could handle whatever needed handling. "It was on the table because I left it there on purpose," Mara said. Nora absorbed this without visible reaction, which was as close as she got to being moved. "You should have told me," she said. "I was waiting to see if you'd pick it up." A silence. "That's manipulative," Nora said. "A little," Mara agreed. The corner of Nora's mouth moved in a way that Mara had come to recognize as her version of a laugh that she'd decided not to fully commit to. She turned and went back to arranging the supply shelf, and the conversation was over, but it left something in the room that stayed after the words did. Some new configuration between them that was more open than what had been there before. The legal proceedings against Black Ridge ran for several months, the way federal cases did, and Mara was called to testify in Hartwell in the early spring. She rode there with Gideon and spent 3 days in a room with lawyers and a federal judge, explaining her analysis of the fraudulent documents in the same plain language she'd used with Crane, and the experience was not comfortable. Blackridge's lawyer, a man from back east who wore very good boots and the expression of someone accustomed to winning through complexity, spent the better part of a morning attempting to establish that her conclusions were speculative and that her credentials were insufficient. But she had her father's training, and her father had trained her specifically for rooms where people would try to make her feel that what she knew was less than what she knew. She answered every question directly. She stayed in her register. When the lawyer said with a careful smile, "And you would describe yourself as a trained physician and financial expert based on what exactly? Apprenticeship? Private study?" She said, "Based on 20 years of direct training and practice. The same foundation as most physicians currently practicing in this territory, with the additional dimension of financial forensic analysis. I can provide the specific methodology I used if the court would find that useful." The judge, who was in his 60s and had the look of someone who had sat through enough legal theater to have lost patience with it, said, "I think we'd find that very useful, Mrs. Cross. Please proceed." She proceeded. Blackridge was convicted on 11 counts. His assets were seized. The illegal foreclosures were overturned by court order, which meant that the paper Burl Estes had wanted to see came through, and Hector Maines got the deed to his land back in an envelope with a federal court seal on it, and the 14 families in the Pine Ridge Valley received certified documents reversing the fraudulent liens and restoring what had been taken. It didn't restore the years. It didn't give back the time spent grinding against a manufactured debt, or the nights people had lain awake calculating what couldn't be made to add up, or the particular corrosive damage that financial fear does to a person's sense of what's possible. The damage was real, and it didn't disappear because the paperwork was reversed. But the land was there, and people were still on it, and sometimes that was the foundation you had to work with. Spring came to the valley the way it always came to mountain country. Not gently, not with the soft focus arrival that people who lived at lower altitudes associated with the season, but abruptly and with still cold nights and mud so deep the wagon sank to its axles in the yard and had to be moved by main force and swearing. Gideon swore at the wagon on a Tuesday morning in March, and Thomas and William pulled on the harness, and Eli stood nearby offering commentary that wasn't useful, and Mara watched from the porch with coffee, and thought that this was probably exactly what every morning had looked like on this ranch for the last 15 years, before and after Clara, and it had the quality of something so rooted and habitual that it would take more than weather or debt or grief to actually uproot it. She thought about that a lot in the months following everything, about rootedness, about what it actually consisted of. She'd been a person who moved. That had been her life's structure. Move, adapt, establish just enough of a foothold to function, and then move again either because something drove her out or because staying felt like surrendering to a story about herself she wasn't sure she wanted. She told herself this was practicality. She told herself it was self-sufficiency. And it was those things, partly. But it was also avoidance, and she knew that now with the specific clarity that comes from finding the thing you'd been avoiding finding, which is that home is not a place you discover. It's a place you build, and building requires you to stop moving long enough to pick up the tools. She had picked up the tools, literally in some cases. The ranch was in better shape by spring than it had been since Clara's illness the previous year had begun consuming Gideon's attention and the ranch's resources simultaneously. The barn roof had been properly repaired over the winter. Gideon and Thomas and Mara over 3 cold weekends, with William handing up materials and Samuel below them reading aloud from a pamphlet on structural integrity that he had somehow acquired and considered directly applicable. It wasn't a beautiful repair. The new boards were a slightly different color from the old ones and probably would be for several years, but it held, and the cattle were dry, and in the logic of a working ranch that was the entire point. The garden went in April. Ada had strong opinions about the garden and executed them with her characteristic focused energy, now freed from the crushing weight of managing everything else, which meant she could put all of that organizational intensity into something she actually chose rather than something that had been handed to her by necessity. She consulted Mara on what medicinal plants could be grown alongside the vegetables. Lavender, calendula, a patch of yarrow in the corner that she tended with particular attention. And Mara taught her what each one was for and Ada wrote it all down in a small notebook she'd started keeping, which Samuel had already tried to read twice and been denied access to both times. Bess painted something on the cover of the notebook. She didn't announce this, she just did it and left it on Ada's bed. It was a small, precise drawing of the valley from above, an imagined aerial view that was better than it had any right to be from an 8-year-old's hand. Bess had a gift that nobody had been paying much attention to because the circumstances hadn't allowed for paying attention to gifts, and Mara noticed it and started leaving paper out in the kitchen, which was not subtle but was effective. The twins turned 14 in March and became, almost overnight, people of strong and divergent opinions. Thomas had decided, with the sudden conviction of a 14-year-old discovering direction, that he wanted to know everything about horses, their breeding, their medicine, their mechanics. He and Mara had weekly conversations about equine anatomy that were, she thought, the most purely enjoyable medical conversations she'd had since her father died, because Thomas had the combination of genuine curiosity and refusal to accept incomplete answers that made for the best students. William wanted to go to law school. He announced this at supper one evening with the calm certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than a preference, and the table was quiet for a moment, and then Samuel said, "I thought I was the smartest one." And William said, "You are. I'm just the most strategic one." And even Gideon almost smiled. Eli, at 6 turning 7, remained himself, observant, direct, emotionally sophisticated in ways that regularly surprised adults, who made the mistake of assuming that small size correlated with small interiority. He'd adopted the barn cat's remaining kittens as a personal responsibility and had named them all after people he'd decided were important, which included Mara, which she learned about not from Eli but from discovering that one of the kittens answered, unreliably, to her name. "You named the cat after me," she said, the morning she figured it out. "She's the bravest one," Eli said, as though this were the full explanation. "I'm the one who pulled her out of the wall," she said. "That's why she's named after you," he said, and went back to his breakfast with the satisfied expression of someone who has tied up a logical thread neatly. The thing between her and Gideon was not something that announced itself. It wasn't a moment with the specific quality of a declaration. It wasn't a scene with clear edges. It was more like a gradual shift in temperature, the kind you don't notice while it's happening, and then one day you register that it's spring, and you can't exactly identify the morning when winter ended. He'd been, from the beginning, a man who expressed things through action rather than articulation. He brought coffee when she was working late. He fixed the window latch in her examination room without being asked because he'd noticed it didn't sit right. When she came home late from a difficult case, a difficult birth in January, a mother and child who both came through but barely, and Mara had sat in the cold barn afterward for 20 minutes, just breathing. He'd been in the kitchen when she came in, not saying anything, just there, which was the thing she needed, and which she couldn't entirely explain the gratitude she felt for it. One evening in April, they were on the porch after supper, the children's voices coming from inside in that layered evening texture that had become the sound she associated now with the specific feeling of not being alone in the essential way. The mountains were doing their sunset thing, the colors aggressive and insisting, the light going gold and then deeper, the peaks going dark. "I got another letter from Crane," she said. He looked at her. "He has a case in the Northern Territory. Similar structure to what Blackridge was doing, but larger. He wants a consulting analysis of the financial documents." A silence. "Is it something you'd do from here?" he asked. "Or, from here," she said. "He'd send the copies. It's document work, not field work." He nodded. He was looking at the mountains. "You should do it." "I already wrote back saying yes," she said. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "Of course you did." "I wanted to tell you." "I know." He looked back at the mountains. "I want you to do it. All of it. The consulting, the practice, whatever else comes." He said it the way he said things he'd been carrying around for a while and had finally organized into words. "When I wrote that advertisement, I wrote it the way I did because I was trying to be honest about what I had, which wasn't much. Land that was being taken, 7 kids, not much else." He paused. "I didn't know what I was asking for." She looked at him. "I don't think I knew what I was answering either," she said. He reached over and took her hand, which was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of someone who had been wanting to do a simple thing for a long time and had decided to stop complicating the wanting. His hand was large and rough and warm, and she didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything. And the mountains went dark and the stars came out over Pine Ridge in that pressurized density that never stopped being astonishing. From inside the house, Eli's voice rose suddenly in the particular register that preceded either a discovery or a catastrophe. With Eli, the two were often the same. And Ada said something firm, and Thomas laughed, and then there was a crash that sounded like the wooden bowl. Gideon got up. Mara followed him in. The bowl was on the floor. Eli was looking at it with the expression of someone who had not intended this outcome but could see how the sequence of events had been moving toward it. Samuel was trying very hard to look as though he'd had no involvement. "I was demonstrating gravity," Samuel said. "You dropped the bowl," Nora said. It was a demonstration." "It was supper," Ada said, crouching to pick up whatever had been in the bowl, and was now on the floor, and the four of them had a brief argument about the nature of scientific inquiry versus household responsibility, while William watched from the corner with the expression of a person compiling material, and Bess quietly gathered the spilled beans one at a time from the floor, with the focused precision of someone who had long ago concluded that the best response to chaos was quiet usefulness. Gideon picked up the bowl. Eli looked up at him with total sincerity. "It wasn't my fault," he said. "It never is," Gideon said. Mara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the room, and thought about the word home. What it meant to people who'd always had it, which was probably that they didn't think about it much, the way you don't think about breathing. What it meant to people who'd lost it, which was an absence that shaped everything around it. And what it meant to people like her, who had spent a long time looking for it in the wrong places before understanding that it wasn't a place you found, it was a thing you made over time, with specific people, in the specific mess of daily life, in the wooden bowl on the floor, and the kitten named after you, and the 16-year-old reading your father's anatomy text by lamplight, and the man who brought coffee when you were working late. Her father had told her, near the end, that the two most important things in a life were work worth doing and people worth doing it for. He'd been practical about it. No sentiment, no embellishment, just the plain accounting of what he'd found to matter after 30 years of paying attention. She thought she understood it when he said it. She understood it differently now. The bowl was back on the table. The beans were salvaged, mostly. The argument about gravity had concluded with a partial victory for science and a firm ruling against future demonstrations involving the supper things. Eli had been assigned the specific responsibility of apology, which he executed with the thoroughness of someone who took responsibilities seriously, even when they'd been somewhat involuntary. "Sorry," he told Samuel. "You should be," Samuel said. "I'm not that sorry," Eli clarified. Nora put supper on the table and they sat down, all 9 of them, the table still slightly too small but not by as much as it had seemed in October. The lamplight was the same lamplight. The mountains were the same mountains. The wind off the peaks was cold and carrying the smell of the pine forest and the coming summer and whatever was on the other side of the season. Mara sat at her end of the table. She had arrived here with a locked trunk and a bruised past and no clear idea of what she was looking for. Only the knowledge that she was tired of moving and tired of going alone and tired of carrying the weight of her father's work without a place to put it. She had found 7 children who needed someone to stay. She had found a man who needed someone to tell him the truth about what was happening to his land. She had found a valley that needed someone who knew how to look at what was actually there rather than what someone else wanted them to see. She had found, at the end of what she'd carried for 4 years, not the relief of putting something down, but the discovery that the things she carried were finally in the right hands, her own, and not alone. The trunk was in her examination room now, not in her bedroom. She'd moved it when she opened the practice because that was where it belonged. Open. In use. Her father's instruments laid out properly, the ledgers accessible on the shelf above the examination table, the anatomy text open most days to whatever page she or Nora or Thomas had last been consulting. Not a relic, not a burden, a practice. She had stopped running from what she knew how to do. She had stopped apologizing for knowing it. That was, she thought, the thing she'd needed to find all along. Not the place, not even the people, though the place and the people were the conditions that made it possible. The thing she'd needed to find was simply the conviction that what she had to offer was real, and that the people in her life were worth offering it to, and that staying was not a small thing but a choice with weight and meaning and the full consequence of being somewhere, finally, on purpose. Gideon passed her the bread. She took it. Outside, the valley lay in the early dark, and the stars were coming on one by one the way they always did out here. Not all at once, but each one becoming visible as the eye adjusted, until what had looked like plain dark became something full of depth and light, and the sense that the world was considerably larger and more enduring than any single trouble in it. Mara Holloway Cross ate her supper, and she did not think about leaving because leaving was no longer something she thought about. She was already where she was going,